Oh, yes. Pale blood. Well, you've come to the right place. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration. You need only unravel its mystery. But where's an outsider like yourself to begin? Easy, with a bit of Yharnam blood of your own. But first, you'll need a contract. Good. All signed and sealed. Now, let's begin the transfusion. Oh, don't you worry. You may think it all a mere bad dream.
Greetings. I have just come back from the latest hunt, and with it came some reaffirmed feelings and also some hard pills to swallow. Bloodborne is one of those titles that doesn't come very often, and I don't mean in the sense of it being a masterpiece where they've become more common when you combine the AAA and indie scene together, but I mean by its status in gaming. Bloodborne is revered by its community, and there are good reasons as to why. It's also a title that is frozen in time, seemingly doomed to stay on the console with an unlikely future of coming onto other platforms. At the time of its release, I didn't have a PS4, but I wanted the game that much that I was willing to buy a console for it. That's how big of a deal it was for me back then. And by that point, I was already hooked on the Souls Kool-Aid. I wanted more games like it. And back in 2015, there still weren't that many options compared to now, and after Dark Souls 2, I was ready for more From Software content. I had seen some very early screenshots back then when it was known as Project Beast, but before that I actually thought it was Demon Souls 2 for some reason. Although little did I know that not only would it be something else different from the Dark Souls lineup, but also one of From Software's most unique titles to date. I had to wait the whole year to get a PS4 for Christmas just to play Bloodborne at its fullest. But throughout that time, I would get some opportunities to play it from a friend of mine who had a PS4, and when I was able to finally dive into it after obtaining my own, I was buried 6 feet under in endlessly glazing the game, where it became more like Glazeborne rather than Bloodborne. It had become my game of the year for 2015, and honestly, it still is. And over the years, I would replay it from time to time because I had enjoyed it that much. But my last playthrough was an enlightening experience, to say the least. For context here, throughout the years that is, I'd gotten to play Sekiro, Elden Ring, and its DLC, and I also managed to revisit Demon Souls on the PS3, which is admittedly pretty dated, but also stands out in its own way, where it was more about environmental challenges, the slow but methodical approach to combat, and the arduous journey that one would face throughout each level. Playing those games gave me differing perspectives between each other and allowed me to appreciate the changes brought by them, and they also magnetized things that were wrong with each other. Now, the reason I hadn't talked about Bloodborne earlier in my YouTube history is because I hadn't played it at the time, and only just now I had gotten through a playthrough from beginning to end, and now I can finally talk about the game with a refreshed perspective, because my previous perspective on the game was somewhat dated, due to, like I said, not playing it for quite some time. And what I can say now is that my opinion on the game has changed in some ways, where it isn't quite the same as it was earlier on during its prime years. To be very clear, I still love Bloodborne, and I always will, but man, it does have some problems, and the problems I have with Bloodborne are the things that make me appreciate games like Sekiro and Elden Ring even more, where I'm like, thank God they fixed this, thank God they didn't bring that back. So this isn't really going to be a review or oh, this is something that you didn't know about Bloodborne, or here's another way of looking at the game. Everyone else has already done stuff like this for Bloodborne and has dissected the game so much. Instead, I'm just going to give my own honest thoughts and feelings on what I like and didn't like about Bloodborne. So let's get started. Bloodborne, like Dark Souls 1, also has a special relationship with me because of the impact it made on me at the time. Dark Souls 1 provided me a unique experience unlike anything else I had known back then, and it also showed me that difficult games could actually be fun, that difficult games actually got easier as you took the time to study and master its world and its mechanics. I'm no master on either of these games, or in Bloodborne for that matter, but I can dive into them and complete those games anytime I feel like it. With Bloodborne, the gameplay felt like Dark Souls 1 and yet felt far more aggressive in a way that forced me to break bad habits that I developed from playing 1 and 2. In 1, I played more defensively and passively, waiting for attacks to appear rather than attack. But in Bloodborne, playing defensively made it harder. It was more about being up close and learning to be comfortable with imminent danger. And this was something that really stood out for me in Bloodborne's gameplay. It felt incredibly tight and focused in a similar vein to Sekiro, where instead of being a jack of all trades, it opts for an idea, a vision for a new flavor of combat that was familiar but unique. In Bloodborne, you had the gun and the melee weapon working together. You would use the gun to stun or parry enemies, and the melee weapon to dish out damage and go for viscerals. It was admittedly a struggle to get used to being aggressive and not having the security of a shield or being passive, but Bloodborne gives you not only results from that desire for aggression, but also rewards you even and encourages you to do one defining thing that incentivizes it more than any other FromSoft game, and that is the rally system that combines with the aggressive gameplay of Bloodborne. So when you take damage, you get a small opportunity to recover health from attacking, and this heavily encourages hit trading, where you take some damage, then you also have a quick successive opportunity to attack back and get the health that you lost back. The rally mechanic and the aggressive gameplay made it so that as long as you could keep a level head after taking damage, you could still pick that health back up and continue fighting, which kept the aggressive loop going. And while you could still be aggressive in the other games, you have to be far more careful because you no longer have the benefit of recovering health unless you count flasks. Bloodborne was all about fast-paced, hyper-aggressive combat where you were punished for keeping your distance and rewarded for taking the fight to the enemies and being up in their face. And I loved the way Bloodborne did that. The rally mechanic is similar to other life drain mechanics or item usages that can be found in other games. Elden Ring technically has it once you have Melania's Rune and the Godskin Swaddling Cloth Talisman, as well as the Blood Tax Ash of War. Lies of P also has a similar system, and that's another fantastic game, by the way. Probably the best non-From Software game that I've played so far, honestly. However, there does come a point where the rally system itself gets harder to use, and you can't really rely on it as much anymore, especially in the second half and to some extent in the DLC, because in those parts of the game, the enemies are so punishing with their damage output that playing too aggressively for the sake of getting your health back through rallying becomes way too risky, especially with bosses like Abredis or Orphan of Kos or Ludwig or Lawrence, where they can absolutely nuke your health before you even know it. However, in the first half, the rally mechanic works a lot better. Enemies can still dish out considerable damage, but aren't as overwhelming with their damage outputs, so that you can still afford some aggression and risk. This means that it becomes less useful in the long run, and the reliance of reading attack patterns and tells and dodging becomes more of a priority rather than just simply relying on the rally mechanic where you're always risking taking damage. So I'm 50-50 on the rally system. Some enemies, especially the fights that are just not fun, makes me not rely on it that much because it either punishes me in certain ways that just outright kills me and then I have to do runbacks, or if I go for a rally opportunity, it's then immediately followed by another big devastating attack that takes away a lot of the health that I tried to get back in the first place. So nevertheless, I relied more on just being aggressive, learning to read tells, learning to dodge more efficiently, rather than just using the rally mechanic itself. But that's not to say that it's completely useless, because it can come in clutch at times, and it can help you while you're still being aggressive but smart at the same time, especially in some of the boss fights that I really enjoy, like Ligarius, Ludwig, Maria, Gascoigne, German, and Orphan to a lesser extent, the rally mechanic here can do wonders at times. Then there is the vial system, as in the healing system for this game. In other Souls games, minus Demon Souls, you had Estus flasks, or an equivalent flask like an Elden Ring that would regenerate. In Bloodborne though, you had to replenish your heals, kind of like in Demon Souls, and if you abused them too much, like I did in some fights, guess what? It's time to play Farming Simulator, where you have to either grind echoes to buy vials, or you go to other places where you can get consistent vial drops from enemies. Initially, it's not much of a problem in the first half, but when you start fighting the later bosses that do so much damage on top of the DLC bosses, and with these bosses that can just destroy your health where you have to constantly heal just to, sustain another attack, you're going to need a good supply of them before attempting another run. The blood vials also add to other existing issues that aggravated me even more during my playthrough, and made the runbacks to bosses even more of a chore than it needed to be. So, like I've said, there are some issues I have with the game, and some of these issues all synergize in a way that I can't really tolerate anymore, especially after coming back to it for so long and after playing games like Sekiro and Elden Ring that didn't make me deal with this sort of shit. So, here are some of the problems. Vial farming, or just the existence of blood vials and how they're implemented in the game, as well as the lack of warping or resetting the area. The hub-based approach similar to the Nexus is cool, like the one from Demon Souls, and it does give you a means to stock up and upgrade when necessary, but the problem is that it forces you every single time to go back there just to go to another location through a warping method. It made sense in Demon Souls because that game operated on a hub-based level structure where each level was its own separate entity and wasn't interconnected like it was in Dark Souls 1. But in Bloodborne, it has Dark Souls 1's level design where the areas are interconnected, save for some exceptions. It is beyond infuriating that I have to suffer through multiple loading screens, not just for farming, but just to go to another area while skipping the point A to point B journey like it's a pilgrimage. I don't know why you couldn't just have the option to reset at the lantern to continue seamless farming like in Dark Souls or in Elden Ring or in Sekiro, or the option to just warp to another place to begin with. What if I didn't need to go to the Hunter's Dream just yet and I just wanted to warp somewhere else to continue, either farming for other things or just to continue progressing through a particular area, and then when I have enough of what I need, I can then go to the Hunter's Dream. But in this game, I just have the Hunter's Dream. The lanterns only take me there, and from that point on, I have to go to the gravestones to go to another different area, and this means I have to go through 2 loading screens every time, and I'm sick of it. And this is coming from someone that's played this game multiple times. I've platinumed it on PS4, and every time I play Bloodborne, this problem just gets worse and worse, and it made me appreciate the fact that Sekiro and Elden Ring brings back warping. It brings back the option to reset the area to continue farming, so I don't have to go somewhere else just to continue farming in that area. Now, someone might say that it's for lore reasons, but sometimes the lore and mechanics and the intuitiveness of gameplay can overlap at the expense of a more enjoyable and seamless experience that was realized in Dark Souls 1 and 2, Sekiro and Elden Ring. And when lore makes a part of the gameplay more tedious than it needs to be, just for the sake of continuity, then the lore surrounding it should be changed or altered. I could reset and warp at the bonfires or the Site of Grace or the Sculptor's Idol. I could level up in those places, save for in Dark Souls 2, all the while engaging in the world at the same time, where in Bloodborne, the Hunter's Dream is the source of my leveling, and also the source of fast traveling, all at the cost of 2 loading screens. Which one do you prefer at this point? Which method is more intuitive and doesn't break up the gameplay as much? You decide, because I already have my own opinion about it. And even with the Bold Hunter's Mark, that's still another loading screen that you have to go through. And then to keep that consistent progress of using the Bold Hunter's Mark to stop yourself from going to the Hunter's Dream, you have to go to the Hunter's Dream to buy more Bold Hunter marks to then repeat this process And throughout this whole time, you're still going through multiple loading screens. So one for the Hunter's Dream and the other to go back to the place you visited. And then when you use the Bold Hunter's Mark, it activates the loading screen. Then when you activate the lantern, you go back to the Hunter's Dream, another loading screen, and then back to where you came from, which is another loading screen. This game just loves loading screens, and I absolutely hate it at this point. I'm sick of it. I'm so sick of doing this shit. Like, Sekiro and Elden Ring didn't make me go through loading screens to this degree when I'm grinding for stuff that I need to progress further. Now, if they ever remaster Bloodborne or remake it, I hope that they fix this sort of shit so that it makes it less tedious and I can focus more on the best parts of the game, because the best parts of the game is not the loading screens. I can tell you that much. For me, at this point, it's just unnecessary extra steps that I just cannot tolerate anymore. And I hate grinding for vials. And it's worse since not every enemy drops them. And if blood vials are the main source of healing that is taken from enemy blood, which I'm assuming is the case when you kill enemies, hence, with blood vials, then shouldn't every enemy be dropping blood for vials to begin with? Maybe this idea wasn't as well realized as they might have thought when they were making the game. Maybe instead they could have done something like, say, limit the amount of vials you have, but make it so that the vials can be replenished from enemy kills. That way you can still keep going through the loop. And this would negate the necessity to grind for vials every time, where you're consistently killing enemies while restocking on vials that you need to save for the boss fights. I mean, there could have been other ways of just implementing a healing system, but at least it would have been one way to prevent you from wasting precious echoes that you could use for leveling or other items that you can use instead of more healing items. But that's just how I feel about it. Everyone may have a different opinion on this, but for me, I'm just tired of farming vials. I don't want to farm vials ever again. Moving on from all that, let's talk about some of the other things, like say the content overall. It's pretty mixed here. In terms of the story and the lore and the atmospheric set pieces and the setting itself, it is amazing. I love it so much. It has differing themes that works well in Bloodborne's fashion of gothic and Victorian aesthetics, the blend of action and cosmic horror. One comment I vaguely remember reading, I can't remember if it was exactly as it says what I'm about to say, but it's that the first half of Bloodborne's story is like Edgar Allan Poe, and the second half is like H.P. Lovecraft. The game flips the script on you halfway through, where you're not just dealing with a beast hunt anymore, but something far worse as you discover what's really going on. The first half experience is fantastic. Yharnam is such a well-designed place with lots of interconnectivity that reminded me of Dark Souls 1's level design with the Undead Burg. But the second half for me personally has more moments of frustration, annoyance, rather than enjoyment and excitement as to explore the places further. Thematically though, it's amazing. Gameplay wise though, it gets to a point where I just want to wrap things up here quicker because the levels just don't really feel as fleshed out or not quite as interesting to explore, and the enemies aren't as interesting or as fun to fight for that matter, and some of the bosses at this phase aren't that enjoyable either. And that's another thing, the boss roster and quality overall isn't as consistent as I would like it to be when you take the DLC out of the equation, especially, where the DLC has arguably the best bosses in the entire game. Mikolash is an annoying fight and is even worse than the DLC. The one Reborn is just a giant heap of flesh that's just way too big for the camera, although I do appreciate the nod to the Tower Knight fight from Demon's Souls. Abritus is thematically awesome with a great soundtrack behind it, but for me, a lot of the times, it's just a miserable fight, even in spite of the mechanical depth that she has. And don't even get me started on her version in the Chalice dungeon. There are a few bosses that I enjoyed fighting in the main game. Cleric Beast is a great starting boss to get you warmed up in the type of combat that you're about to experience. Gascoigne evens the playing field, showing you what a hunter-style boss fight is going to be like, and it raises the stakes with his transformation. Ligarius was a fun and intense fight that punished distancing. Gurman was a fantastic final boss that's one of my personal favorites in the game. But other than that, a lot of the bosses were either just okay, somewhat decent, or some were just like, thank God that's over. Whether they were just boring or unfun to fight. In the case of the DLC, I still think it's one of the best DLCs From Software has done and has the best boss fights in the entire game, like I said. Ludwig, Maria, and Orphan are the best Bloodborne bosses, period. They are uniquely difficult and relatively fair bosses that you can always keep up with, that test your boundaries of pressure play unlike any other boss in Bloodborne. And every time that I do beat them, I do feel immense satisfaction, although with Orphan I feel satisfaction for a different reason, which I'll get into later. I always look forward to fighting Ludwig and Maria in particular when I play through Bloodborne. But fights like Abritus, Dark Beast Parl, and to some extent Orphan of Kos are fights that I dread doing, but feel immense satisfaction finishing so that I don't have to worry about them again in the playthrough. These sorts of bosses each have their own unique problems, but also their own depth of mechanics. And the problems that make it hard to get into the fun zone of Bloodborne's hyper-aggressive combat also for me diminishes the fun that I have overall when I play the game. With Abritus, the hitboxes are cursed, and her charge attack is one of the most bullshit moves I've ever experienced in the game. I either get really lucky and dodge all the charge attacks, or I get enough distance where she just misses on her final attack during the charge. She hits like a truck, makes you waste more vials if you get hit too often, just so that you don't get killed in the next hit, and when you get stuck on bosses in the Souls games, you generally have that security of replenished healing items. Even in the Elden Ring DLC with the final boss, I never had to worry about healing items. All I had to worry about was just mastering the boss and its mechanics. But in Bloodborne, if I run out of vials, I then have to go farm for more. That way I can focus on healing at times when it's absolutely necessary. And if I run out of heals, I then have this annoying cycle of going elsewhere farming, loading times, back to the area after loading time, go down to wherever I need to go to get to the boss, repeat until I finally beat it. It's just a far more repetitive and annoying way of going through this trial and error method. Whereas in Elden Ring, no matter how hard it got, I never had to worry about those extra steps. Although in saying that, Abritus, like I said, with her theme and her thematics, is amazing. And when you do get a handle of when to punish and when to position, it does make for one of the better bosses in the main game. With Dark Beast Parl, the camera just doesn't really work here compared to some of the other bosses. He is way too large, and his constant movements make it difficult to position properly with lock-on, so not using it and fighting without the camera lock-on makes the fight easier. And don't even get me started on Lauren Dark Beast, who is even worse. In fact, some of the Chalice versions are just more miserable versions to fight compared to the main game versions. In my playthrough at this time, I didn't unfortunately go through all of the Chalice bosses, but there were some standouts like the Yharnam Queen, the Bloodletting Beast, and the Watchdog. As for the rest though, they're either forgettable or are just more frustrating than fun to fight. And Chalice dungeons in general are a part of the game I never really enjoyed that much, and with the emulation, I wasn't able to fully utilize its online capabilities, which was unfortunate. Then there is the matter of Orphan of Kos. Man, this fight. I'm pretty conflicted with Orphan of Kos, to be honest with you, even though I think this is still an amazing fight, because I can see the brilliance of Orphan of Kos and also the aspects that make this fight very frustrating. I know some people have considered this guy to be the best final boss or the best DLC final boss. I wish I could feel the same way. I agree that he's the hardest boss in the game. I agree that he's one of the hardest bosses From Software has done, but I don't necessarily agree that he's the best final boss or best boss in Bloodborne, because how I feel after beating him is completely different compared to beating someone like, say, Ludwig or Gehrman or Maria. With Ludwig, I felt like the fight was difficult while still being fun to get into. With Orphan, he was difficult, annoying, frustrating, wildly unpredictable, and janky with certain animation changes that would completely screw me over during a close victory or moments where I thought I could go in for a safe punish, and then suddenly he just does this random lightning quick attack that I had absolutely no time to react to or prepare for. And these things collectively makes the fight with Orphan not as enjoyable compared to a fight with, say, Ludwig or Maria. The worst part about this is that thematically it's an amazing fight, and it's a fight I really want to like more than I actually do. You find this dark and terrible secret in the DLC, and it delves further into the lore and the mythos of Bloodborne. However, fighting Orphan is something I know I want to get over with sooner, so that I can move on with the rest of the game. When I was fighting Orphan, I was reminded of Consort Radahn and how I felt fighting him, and while I get that final bosses are supposed to be hard, it should feel more like a rewarding challenge and not like a punishment, where you're either dealing with anime level attacks that your character can barely keep up with, or janky animations with inconsistent hitboxes that destroy your health. Orphan though, compared to Consort, is still very satisfying to beat, a bit more so than Consort himself. Orphan and Consort were really the only fights in the From Software series that genuinely had my heart pumping due to the intensity displayed in those fights, how much they demanded from me and how much they forced me into being comfortable with imminent danger up close. And yet at the same time, I get the feeling of both satisfaction and relief. And when I think of bosses like Lord Ishin, Slave Knight Gale, Ludwig or Maria, I always look forward to retrying them. I question to myself, what other ways could I fight these bosses? But when I think of bosses like Consort Radahn or Orphan of Kos, I think to myself, how much fun am I having with this fight? What is the easiest and most optimal way of beating them? I don't like asking myself these questions. I really want to enjoy fighting them, but I can't because of some of the underlying problems with their patterns, their tells, and their mechanics. That just makes them more frustrating for me than it is with, say, other bosses where I actually enjoy fighting them, even if they're more complex mechanically speaking, but still offering me a more fun fight than what these two bosses offer. Ultimately, fights like Orphan and Consort are just fights that make me feel satisfaction and relief after I beat them, while the excitement and anticipation for those fights is non-existent because I'm dreading the fact that I'm going to have to go through these fights if I want to close the book on the DLCs. And I also know that during these fights, I'm going to experience more frustration than genuine enjoyment of experimenting in the fights and also playing around with them. However, in saying that, they're not necessarily bad bosses, they're just very frustrating for me, and I'm aware that there are more optimal ways of beating them more efficiently, but the thing is, I don't find them as fun as the other bosses, and having those optimal measures of executing better executions in these fights would just reinforce my desire to get the fights over with quicker rather than treat the fights I enjoy the most like a sandbox of boss combat. And when I think on Bloodborne's overall boss quality, it's pretty short compared to some of the other games in the From Software lineup. Even with Elden Ring's massive roster where it's more quantity than quality, there are still more quality bosses than what you have in Bloodborne's base game and its DLC. Even Dark Souls 3 has an overall more consistent roster of main game bosses and DLC bosses, and yet when the highs of the highest boss fights in Bloodborne reach the summit, they reach the goddamn peak of that mountain. Because bosses like Ludwig and Maria and Orphan to an extent really do outshine every other boss in Bloodborne overall, and I still think they're some of the greatest bosses that From Software has done, despite some of the frustrations that they each have. As for Lawrence as a boss, amazing theme. That's followed by a fight that I hate, even more than Orphan. I don't enjoy this fight at all. And then there's Living Failures. For me overall, the boss quality in Bloodborne is not as good as I remembered. Very few actually stood out to me in the base game, and the best ones are in the DLC, which carries a lot of the game's overall quality, if I'm being honest. What holds this flawed masterpiece though, is in the other aspects that I love about the game, the things that gave me that unique experience that some of the other FromSoft games didn't. The main reason why I rank Bloodborne higher than Dark Souls 3 is the same reason I appreciate Dark Souls 2 so much as a game. It tries to do something different from its predecessor, and the efforts made in Bloodborne led to one of the most unique combat systems that I've experienced in an action game. The fusion of melee and gun combat in a Victorian and Gothic setting with the aggressive approach to the combat is just amazing. Every weapon you have feels unique, and you can't really go wrong with your choices generally speaking because they all work in service of the same aggressive style combat. The Gothic and the Victorian aesthetics, like I said, along with the Lovecraftian atmosphere and the world building, is so damn cool. And the drip that you have in Bloodborne is insane here. But at the same time, there are some sacrifices that come along with this Victorian drip. The environments of the areas in Bloodborne do generally become the same-ish, where I start missing some of the color and locale variety from Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring. I also miss the build variety that you had in Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring, where a player could truly stand out from the rest, regardless of the statistics. But with Bloodborne, even with your efforts to mix and match with the weapons and the armor, everyone eventually just ends up looking the same, and whatever weapon you do use is still in service of the game's aggressive melee-based combat system. For some people, it's a small price to pay for the game's unique combat, but for someone that has done multiple playthroughs, I don't really get that much mileage out of it compared to those two games. Bloodborne was a game that I glazed throughout the years. I even said that it was the best From Software game for a long time. But after experiencing games like Sekiro and Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3, and revisiting Bloodborne with my recent playthrough, I'm not really so sure anymore. The quality of life changes that came from Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro and Elden Ring made going through certain parts of Bloodborne more aggravating than before. Not being able to respec sucked, and I was missing the verticality of Sekiro and the complete feeling of build expression found in Elden Ring, on top of the color and locational variety that you had along with it. With this collectively speaking, this makes me like Bloodborne less than those other games. And the thing is, I still love Bloodborne as a game, and I always will, and I want to make that clear again. But I can't really see it as this perfect, chiseled masterpiece anymore, because it's just not. It never has been. And people in the From Software community still glaze the living shit out of this game, and this is coming from someone that used to do the same thing. And like I said, playing it again made me appreciate the things that the later titles added even more. And even in spite of the issues that I had with Shadow of the Erdtree's DLC on top of Elden Ring's base game, to be honest with you, I got more out of that game overall than I did with Bloodborne recently. Which is why I can't say that Bloodborne is my favorite game in the From Software lineup anymore. It just isn't. It's still in my top 3, but it's not number 1. Sorry Bloodborne, but it's gonna go to Elden Ring. Now, does this make it a worse game though? No, of course not. I still have favorites. I'm always gonna have favorites, even though I know that there are games out there that are better than them. I know that I can still see myself playing Bloodborne in the future, same as with, Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro and Elden Ring that are also my favorites alongside Dark Souls 1 and 2. In fact, a lot of them are among my favorite games of all time, but we're just talking about which one's my favorite more so. However, it's saying that Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1 are very unique in terms of my favorites because of the impact and experiences I've gained from those two games, even though I know that I like Elden Ring a lot more as a game, same as with Sekiro. And even in spite of all that, I still rank Bloodborne very high, and it's still in the top 3 because of its unique combat system as well, and also because of the unique experience, like I've said. It gave me that similar feeling that I experienced in Dark Souls 1, where it felt like something new. It felt fresh. Bloodborne challenged my habits and forced me to adapt to new challenges in a way that Dark Souls 1 and 2 couldn't at the time. It still has amazing atmosphere and compositions in the music. The trick weapons in the aggressive movement felt like an angrier and faster version of Dark Souls 1's combat. Bloodborne is truly one of those lifetime games that holds reverence for so long and yet so much contention at the same time, while as you peel the onion layers you see more flaws that come along with it when you contrast the experience of Bloodborne with the later titles that add more quality of life improvements and features that make playing those games easier than revisiting Bloodborne. And since experiencing Bloodborne, I had wanted for more Bloodborne-like experiences, and we've got a few of them nowadays, with varying qualities of course. Lies of P, I feel, is really the only one that can contend somewhat with Bloodborne while still improving some of the gameplay aspects that make some aspects of Lies of P better than in Bloodborne. There are a lot of other things that I could talk about with the game, and things that have already been regurgitated about Bloodborne for the past 10 years, but I just wanted to let my feelings out for this and just have more of a emotive sort of take on the game, and think of the things that rung out to me the most. And again, I can definitely see myself playing Bloodborne again in the future, just not on the emulator, because I had an awful time for the most part, even though a lot of the fights and the boss fights ran fine. Would I like to see a remake? To be honest, I would. I didn't feel like it needed one at the time, but if they do it while fixing some of the issues pertaining the traveling and the loading times, adding a respec option so that your character can experience different builds in the same playthrough, as well as further realizing the aggressive based gameplay, then yeah, I would definitely be on board with that for sure. But at this point, we are still talking about symptoms of Bloodbornium, copes and dreams, something that we're still doing 10 years later, talking about one of From Software's best titles, a game that is still one of the best action games of all time. Bloodborne, despite my feelings, good or bad, is still an amazing, brilliant, flawed, and satisfying game that still shines like a full moonlit sky. Stay safe, everyone, and thank you for watching.